because we're still seeing de minimis shipments on average are still between $55 and $60. So the value has very little to do with it. What it did was it raised that in the consciousness of the importer.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
I loved how you were busting out the fallacies of some of the assumptions and come back around to some of this. But, I've got my own opinion on one of the things where I think that customs needs to, in my opinion, again, put forth the equivalent of reimbursables or something for these massive volumes because and certain requirements similar to the express carriers. But I mean, it's ridiculous to think that they can handle these massive volumes with basically manual stuff. There's no sort system. There's no electronic way of selecting things. It's here you go. No.
It's funny because I wrote that article. There's 3. It's a series. And my original intent was just to address some of the issues because I was hearing so much false information out there. And what was really concerning to me is some of the legislators started repeating some of these fallacies about what de minimis really is and what the intent was. And I was getting lots and lots of phone calls from different press outlets and different individuals asking what my opinion was and to help them educate themselves. So the intent of the article was really to educate because there were so many things, so many rumors, so many inferences on what de minimis really was and what it facilitated and how Type 86 started. And it was really as a result of customs taking the action against customs brokers for filing what they called non-compliant Type 86 entries, which is what de minimis is. And I wanted to outline how the Type 86 actually came into being, what de minimis was, why it was important. And then I started thinking, well, it's one thing to educate people, but then I have to talk about what are the problems with that, because not everyone understands what the problems are. So the first article was, this is what de minimis is, and this is, here's some basic facts. Here's what it's not. Here's what's false. Here's what's, probably true, or we can't confirm it. And then the second article focused on what are the problems. Let's identify what the problems are from both customs perspective and the trade's perspective. And let's talk about what the issues are. And then the third article really was more based on my opinion. What can we do about this? What are some of the options that we have that can really address the de minimis environment? And, taken all together, I thought it was a pretty good snapshot on what de minimis is, what some of the problems are, and then, maybe some solutions of what we can do about it. And I feel for CBP because they went from an environment where they were dealing with containerized freight. And that's how, post-war trade has been done in containers. And you had importers, and importers were associated with that container. And they controlled the container. They controlled the transportation. They paid the duty. They actually facilitated the whole thing from start to finish. And then you start seeing more direct-to-consumer transportation and direct-to-consumer sales. And what a lot of people thought was that the express industry really pushed this, that, they facilitated this. And to a degree, yeah, that's true.
I was a major part of that discussion at that era, at that time. And I know you and I really hammered a lot of things out as we were going through that. But it evolved way past what the express carriers were doing.
Well, I think it evolved for a couple of reasons. One, in the beginning, the express couriers and the truck carriers were the only parties that could actually request a release from customs in an automated fashion. And truck was kind of accidental, I think, from the customs perspective. When they went to look at how do we automate the truck manifest, which was one of the first pieces of ACE that was rolled out, they said, okay, what are all the release mechanisms in a manifest? And how do we ensure that it's automated? And one of the things that carriers used to do was request Section 321 release. They also used to request instruments of international traffic. And so customs looked at both of those kind of in the same vein and said, we need to automate these. There was no regulations. There was no policy that was issued. It was just, here is the manifest ability in an automated fashion that allows you to do what you're doing manually. So that was the first automated Section 321. And then the express industry was growing. 128 was passed, the express regulations. Subsequent to that, you had the amount of de minimis go from 200, which it went to 200 in NAFTA, and then it went to 800 in TIFTIA. And a lot of people think that's what facilitated a lot of the explosion in de minimis freight. And I don't necessarily agree with that because we're still seeing de minimis shipments on average are still between $55 and $60. So the value has very little to do with it. What it did was it raised that in the consciousness of the importers. And they said, oh, hey, maybe we can take advantage of this. Also, something else happened. We all have these phones, and they are a sales mechanism in your pocket. It's thousands upon thousands of catalogs that you can buy things from. So that was the second thing. And then the third thing was that everyone started understanding how easy it was to buy off the internet. Amazon came into prominence, and there was a mechanism to deliver that. And as Amazon grew in their direct-to-customer sales, a lot of the other retailers started doing direct-to-consumer sales. And originally, you had the truck manifest, then you had the with the 19 CFR 128, which is the express regulations. It outlined an automated ability, the second automated ability to ask for customs to release it under Section 321. So that's where the express industry started taking advantage of that to a greater degree. And then you have this explosion in direct to consumer. And this was even before COVID. Customs actually came to the COAC when I was on that, the Commercial Operations Advisory Committee. And Customs, the executive assistant commissioner, came and said, we need help. Our officers need help. We have containers arriving interior ports in the United States, like Des Moines, Iowa, and, St. Louis, that have thousands of shipments in them, and they are requesting a paper Section 320 release. So these were shipments that were big box retailer to big box retailer, and it was an importer to importer, type of scenario. And that big box retailer actually controlled that entire thing. And they discovered, hey, we can do direct to consumer shipments. People can go online, they can go in the store, they can order this, whatever, dress, shirt, shoes, whatever, online. And we have the ability to deliver to them directly. And so they knew that they could take advantage of Section 321. That meant that they were bringing in goods that they knew were selling. So they didn't have inventory costs. They could reduce distribution centers. They could reduce taxes because they aren't actually holding goods in the United States, and it's a sale when it already comes in or when it reaches their distribution center. Customs was opening these, and there were thousands of individual shipments. And before, how Customs addressed that is they would have these importers give them spreadsheets with all of the information, and Customs would download those spreadsheets into the old entry system, and they would be able to be released in a semi-automated fashion. Well, what happened was that old system got retired at Customs. So they could no longer release freight like that. And that required the customs officers to input every single one of those 4,000 shipments in the targeting system. And, there was no way that they could do that because you have 1, 2, 3 person offices at Customs because they'd have 20 or 30 containers, a week. And one customs officer can address that if it's a whole container. But when you're talking about, a whole container, even if it was 10 containers and there were 4,000 each, now that customs officer is putting, 400,000 shipments in themselves.
That's where I'm having a problem, where it was my understanding out of all the, redesigning of the entry process, the clearance process, the different things that were going on. How is it that on these sections that I was under the impression that Customs was going to be requiring electronic manifest to be transmitted into the system, and somehow it's circumvented that? How is that?
No, it didn't really circumvent it, because if you look at how manifests are transmitted, that was really the driver. For truck, you have to list every consignee. For air, you list every consignee. In ocean, you list the master is who actually the goods are being delivered to. And then if you have house bills or sub-house bills, then you list those consignees. And the way the transaction was structured was it was still big box retailer to big box retailer for the transportation. So it said that warehouse. In air, same thing. If you had big box retailer sending a shipment to big box retailer, that's who the consignee was. And it wasn't until it got to the distribution center that the actual sale happened. So the sale was structured to actually not be sold until the goods arrived in the United States. So they didn't have to list each of those individual consignees because the sale was structured in a manner where the big box retailer was still the importer. And so Customs was not happy with that. They weren't happy with that.
Those goods are cleared into the commerce under an entry. So a big box retailer on the bill of lading to a big box retailer, and they're going to tender a formal entry because of all that. Let's just say, okay, I don't have a problem with that. But if they are looking at individual shipments and their master says box retailer to box retailer, but they are wanting to clear that into the commerce then after that under a Section 321, then to me, I'm like, oh, all bets are off. You have to transmit all those individuals along with the commodities and all of that. Why is that not the case?
They didn't have to do that on the manifest. The manifest rule said you only had to list who it was being delivered to. So it was being delivered to the warehouse. And that's why you have it, and because it was not an automated manifest release request, the manifest served only in a normal manifest environment to tell Customs where it's coming from, what's in the box, and where it's going to. And it still did that. It just said it was going to this distribution center. And what happened from there was that spreadsheet was the entry request. So the entry request was not married or incorporated into the manifest filing. It was two separate things. So you have a manifest filing going to the warehouse. Then you have an entry request for release. That was that spreadsheet with all the individual consignees. So that's what the difference was.
That's how using a spreadsheet was the connotation of how to somewhat, I won't say automated, but how to supposedly efficiently handle these massive thousands of shipments or hundreds of shipments in a container. All right. However, even with that, then there's the physical scenario of what I was hearing is that, okay, let's say that CBP wants to do a few inspections, spot inspections, just for the sake of saying, of what you're declaring, is it in there? And I guess the accusation is, well, we can't, there's like 2 boxes out of hundreds. How are we going to find that? I'm like, sorry, if that's how you're going to clear it, you need an automated way of doing it. Or if it takes you all day to unload that, and it shouldn't be on CBP's fault.
Well, that's the way LTL freight works. Less than truckload freight works that way anyway. So you have one master carton, and then you have individual boxes in a carton. That's how less than container load freight works. It's just that these were smaller packages. So you had 100 in a skid instead of, 10 or 20. So this is also a physical space challenge for CBP if they wanted to look at any of that freight.
See, to me, a physical space challenge is customs is there to facilitate the clearance, the release of it. However, the operator should be responsible, in my opinion, for providing sufficient space, facilities, systems, whatever, to process that. I think it's unrealistic and a horrendous burden on those CBP officers when they show up, pop the doors, and like, oh, son of a biscuit eater, this is too much. And it's like, to me, it's like, no, it's the operator's problem.
Well, that is why CBP started moving to the centralized exam sites within the ports. And their goal is to have a CES, a centralized exam site, in every port so that they have a facility that they can go to or staff that facilitates all of the exams. Yeah, and that's true at most facilities other than the ECO, Express Consignment Operators, and the ECCFs, the Express Consignment Cargo Facilities, which have that box by box exam presentation requirement.
Where I'm going with this is, as you well know, we're both, have been on both sides of this. And obviously I've had a long background with the express carriers. But in looking at that, the CES is being set up by the port and more specifically the government, right? That's where I guess I have a problem, is that if these private sector is electing to do this, then why is there not an effort? And maybe we can talk about this and come up, maybe you and I can talk through and come up and offer some suggestions. Why is there not like a reimbursable or something so that it pays for those facilities and or require those facilities?
I'll tell you why. And I talk about this in the articles too. Because there was an issue with not having enough officers and not having the staffing that is required by TFTIA and other legislation, CBP said we are no longer, and this was probably 10 to 12 years ago, we're going to curtail other facilities that aren't directly related to the port. Because we're having problems staffing the ports themselves, and they're our highest priority. So our officers are going to go there first, and we're going to stop approving or facilitating other types of operating models. And in 10, 12 years ago, if you wanted to get an ECO approved or an ECCF approved, it was very difficult. And CBP even messaged at some point, we aren't going to expand anymore because we simply don't have the officers to be able to staff these locations. So they went to the CES because they could limit the number of officers, limit the number of, facilities they had to go to. They stopped going to container freight stations and much, and said you have to bring your cargo if it's for exam to the CES. So they tried to streamline the availability of the officers. And in doing that, they limited the number of ECCFs and ECOs. So they didn't do it on purpose. They did it for valid reasons. But, 10 years later, man, they're saying we need more ECCFs because, one, there isn't a reimbursable associated with an ECCF. If you're going to bring this cargo in a package by package basis, you need to be able to present it to us on a package level basis. And CES stations and CFS stations aren't built that way. So it's kind of a result of CBP's posture 10, 15 years ago, that they now have limited capability to address the new way freight is coming in. So it's a confluence of factors that just, unfortunately resulted in where we are today is not enough ECCF facilities, a reimbursable program that is, understaffed because of the limitations of having enough CBP officers available, and this new wave in freight. And, you and I both know once COVID hit, that exploded far beyond any analysis or economists thought. It was 12 years of growth in the e-commerce environment in 2 years.
Yeah. Yes. And all right. So as we're talking through this, I guess where I want to go with this, one thing I want to address or make comment on is, again, that the issue, there's a lot of, and you mentioned it, where the express carriers, they pushed for a raise of the de minimis from 200 to 800. And that's where this all started from. And to your point, that's not it. But I will say that, again, I was personally, heavily involved in that era and did an analysis. And at the time, customs system was maxed out and there were still things coming through. And these low dollar entries were clogging the system with entries that had to be processed. So an entry, like let's say an informal entry of $250 shipment was standing in the way of a $25,000 formal entry. The system could only process so many. And when that de minimis was raised, when we analyzed that, the number of entries that were pulled out of the entry system that were being transmitted was astronomical. And it was to the tune of hundreds of thousands of entries less being transmitted per month, I guess, or even week. I don't know, just astronomical numbers. Now, as we progress on down through the road here, and the entry type 86 was designed so that, again, the thought was you didn't have to go through and do an individual entry for the section. It was for those for OGA clearance for an individual item. And yet now it's compounded itself.
See, you're wrong. You're wrong about that. And that's what a lot of people actually think, is that Type 86 was developed to address the PGAs. And that's not correct. What happened was when EAC Todd Owen came to COAC and said, we need a way to automate these hundreds of thousands of entries that are coming in paper, requesting Section 321 release. We need an automated way to handle that because the old system has been retired. We have no ability to get that in an automated fashion anymore. And our officers are having to input this information, and containers are being delayed, a week, 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. And customers are complaining because they're paying demurrage and detention, and customs isn't releasing their goods. And there's no way for us to automate that process. So at that time, we had a work group that was established with every different type of importer and every different type of carrier and all the brokers. And we said, okay, what is the best solution here? So what we said is, hey, let's look at the express process, because one of the things that the brokers have always complained about is the lack of parity for the express carriers, because they have this automated ability to request Section 321, and the truck carriers do too, but brokers don't. So we started on the premise that, okay, ocean carriers aren't going to want to transmit line by line by line information to request a section release. The ocean carriers said, we don't want to be in that business. So if they aren't going to do it, who else can do it? So the brokers said we would do that. So we said, okay, what's the best way to get that done? And we looked at what is known as Code 86 on the Express Manifest, and that is the code that is transmitted to CBP on the Express Manifest to request a Section 321 release. And we said, why don't we just take that same data set, and actually transmit it in ABI? The data set is already there. You know exactly what you need. It could be transmitted in ABI, and that way the brokers could do that. And that's how it got named Type 86. It got actually named after the Express Manifest code. And so the express carrier said, why should we get behind this? You know, we pay all this money in reimbursables. We have a package by package way and all these costs associated with it. Why should we get behind this? So we said, well, can we request PGA clearance on Section 321? Because at that time, and the express carriers did some, rough math and said, we could probably save our clients $20 to $25 million a year, because right now, if we have something subject to an FDA or CPSC, we do that on an informal entry and pay duty, even though it's, $50. So, hey, if you take the PGA record set and attach that in ABI to this Type 86 Section 321 release request, the carriers will get behind it. So the express carrier said, yeah, great. You do that. We'll be okay with this, and we'll move forward. And so that's the only reason. That was the reason it got talked about to begin with, because the express carrier said, what's in it for us? And all the other, brokers said, yeah, that'd be fantastic, because we have to do that now. So it'll give our clients an option to clear Section 321 in a compliant manner with the other government agencies. So that's why the PGA was included. So Customs went back and looked at all the automation and said, how can we build this? Because Todd was like, it needs to be quick, it needs to be cheap, it needs to be fast, because we're getting drowned by these. We have to make sure this works. We can't keep doing this. Well, they looked at all the automation, and it was Jim Byram. And Jim Byram from Customs, they looked at all the automation and said the easiest way to do this, and the most similar to what the actual data elements on the manifest for a Code 86 and the Type 86 in ABI, is to use release. So they took the release message set and said, okay, what's different? Well, the biggest thing that was different was the HTS number. And they said, everything in ABI revolves around an HTS number. And it's virtually impossible for us to pull that out. We'd have to start from scratch in a release mechanism and build it completely differently than what the current release mechanism is. And so they said, okay, we have to include the HTS number. So there was a lot of discussion about, can we use a dummy HTS number? Can there be an HTS number for just a section clearance? Can we bucket it, by, like Canada does for low value imports? Can we do it by chapter or by section? Let's have 10 tariff numbers that actually note what's in the shipment. And they went back and they said, we can't do that. So you have to have an HTS number. And the other government agencies who became involved in this process said, we need that anyway for our PGA. So we said, okay, for PGA, we can do it. But for everything else, it shouldn't be required, because it's not required. on the truck manifest, and it's not required on the express clearance manifest. So we got stuck with that because it was the cheapest and quickest way for CBP to roll this out.
That was one of the things, is that the brokers were hollering and screaming for something like this. And then it was launched, and I'm like, why are they taking forever? But now it's being used widely now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think once people understood what it was, they immediately started using it, because why not? And the express carriers used it for PGA shipments. But that was such a small percentage of what they were actually handling in this section environment.
Because they were still, and the express carriers still used the manifest clearance process for the other stuff, right?
It's more streamlined for their processes. And it's all of their systems are built to actually facilitate that. The last thing I will say is there's a lot of finger pointing going on, saying there's so many violations found in Type 86. And if you look at the volume, of course there are, because that is the vast majority of what's coming into the United States. You have 40 to 50 million normal entries that are 25 or over $800. And then you have 1 billion shipments coming in under that volume. So of course, by percentage, you're going to have more. And I would be worried if customs wasn't finding things in that environment, because that's where the majority of the freight's coming in. If you look at it from a value perspective, the value of Section 321 is still like 10% of what everything else is, even though the volume is so much higher. So the violations are coming in every environment. It just seems like it's more because you're looking at, one package versus one container. And that container might have 5,000 individual packages, but they're both counted as one. So yeah, it does look massive, but of course it does, because it's the majority of the freight.
Cindy, you're always phenomenal. I always love talking with you. It's always great. We need to have some more of this, because this is a deep topic, and I would love to have, folks, if there are any of you out there that are, like what we said or don't like what we say, let us know. And we may even have a nice debate online here, so that we can let's get into the heart of it and deal with this. But thank you, Cindy, so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
All right, folks, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much for joining us. SimplyTrade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, or would like to sponsor SimplyTrade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. SimplyTrade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by SimplyTrade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.